What's up guys, Kyle Blanford with Hypertrophy and PectusWarriors.com. Today we're going to go over the basics of nutrition, calories, and more importantly, macronutrients. How to go about using these to further your goals, whether that's fat loss, building muscle, or improving strength and performance. First, we want to start with calories. All we need to know about calories is that they are a unit of energy. So the amount of energy that we bring into the body through the food that we consume are measured in calories, and then the amount of energy that we're burning off through different activities such as exercising, weightlifting, running, and just breathing are also measured in calories. And the way that we go about setting up a diet for body composition changes or performance enhancement is looking at the amount of energy that we're consuming relative to the amount of activity that we're performing and finding what that balance is based on our goal. So if we're trying to burn off body fat and lose weight overall, we need to be burning off more calories than we're consuming. And vice versa, if we're trying to build muscle mass, we need to be consuming more calories than we're burning. If we're just trying to maintain our weight, then obviously we want those two values to be pretty even. So all in all, calories are pretty simple. From there, we want to understand the macronutrients. You have three different macros: fats, carbs, and proteins. Each one of these does something different in the body, and understanding the mechanisms and roles that each of these play determines how we actually go about setting up the ideal diet for each person. So let's talk about fats first. Fats contain 9 calories per gram, making them the most calorically dense macronutrient of any of the three. Beyond the amount of calories that they pack, they're also incredibly important for hormone production. This is one of the primary reasons we don't want to limit fats too much, because they're so vital in the amount of other bodily processes going on that we don't want to stop that. So beyond the hormone process, they're also very important for joint health. Fats are what lubricate the joints, and if you ever compete in a high level or even an amateur level physique competition or bodybuilding show, and you get to those absurd levels of leanness, one of the things that you'll start to feel towards the end of that process of cutting is how creaky your joints start to feel, because the fat is actually disappearing between those joints and they're not nearly as lubricated as they're supposed to be. So that is something to note, and part of what makes fats so important within your diet beyond just the energy component. Now, talking about carbs, this is where there's a lot of confusion. So remember what we talked about first. Overall calorie intake is the primary reason for any sort of body weight changes. So if you're gaining weight, it doesn't really matter where the calories are coming from if you're consuming more than you're burning off. That's just how thermodynamics work. But carbs have a little bit different effect on weight overall, because it's not just the amount of energy that you're bringing in. Carbohydrates also cause your body to hold on to more water. And every single gram of carbohydrate that you consume, your body holds on to additional 3 grams of water. So that means every 100 or so grams of carbs that you're consuming, another 300 grams of water are coming in and holding on in your body. That's a whole pound. 450-ish grams is about a pound of weight. And so if you're changing your carbohydrate intake drastically, you're going to see massive changes in your overall weight. And this is why one of the first things that you'll see anytime somebody transitions to a ketogenic diet is very rapid weight loss in the first few days or weeks. And that's because if they were usually eating a lot of carbohydrates and then suddenly they cut those out completely and just go for fats and proteins, not only are they losing the weight from being in a caloric deficit, if they are in one, but because they're not consuming all of those carbohydrates, all of that water that's being held by those carbs is also being flushed out of their body too. So the amount of weight loss that it looks like they've achieved is significantly more than the amount of fat that they've actually lost. And all that's not to say that the ketogenic diet and low carb diets don't work. They absolutely do. But at the same time, if you were to take somebody that loses all of that weight on the ketogenic diet and then just introduce carbs again while even keeping them at caloric maintenance or even in a caloric deficit, you're going to see an immediate bump up in weight just because of the amount of water that is being held on to again because of the carb consumption. So all of that is to say, carbs do not make you fat, but understanding that carb consumption actually is going to have a much larger impact on what the scale readout is, just because of the amount of water weight that's affected by it. We're not changing necessarily the amount of fat that you're losing or not losing based on your carb consumption, but the number that you see on the scale can vary wildly. And finally, protein is incredibly important in the diet. Firstly, because it's the building block of muscle tissue. Every single time you go to the gym, you break down tissue. You need protein to repair that broken down tissue. And even if you're not working out, your body is always recycling cells. And protein is a foundational piece of that. So if you're lacking in protein, you're lacking in the very basic tools that your body needs from a recovery standpoint. Beyond that, protein is the most satiating macronutrient, meaning that you're going to feel much more satisfied and much fuller from meals containing higher amounts of protein versus fats and carbohydrates, even at the same amount of calories. So if our goal is weight loss and we're trying to restrict calories and create that caloric deficit, it makes a lot of sense that the foods that we're consuming to make up those calories, we want them to be as filling and satiating as possible. And that's where protein has a lot of bang for its buck. So the way that we go about crafting a diet is first looking at what's the goal. So how do we want our body to change or not change over time? If we're trying to change body composition through either weight loss or muscle being built, then first we need to pick our caloric constraints there. We need to figure out how many calories we need this body to consume relative to our activity levels. And there's a number of calculations that you can use for that. And then once we've got that number in place, we need to divvy up how many of those calories are going to be coming from each of these macronutrients. The first place to start was with protein, because it's going to be most heavily related to the amount of weight and the overall mass of your frame. With protein intake, the easiest place to start is 1 gram per pound of body weight. You probably see different variations of this all over the place, but that is the simplest place to start. If you go a little bit higher than that, that's fine. A little bit lower than that, that's fine. But 1 gram per pound is a very easy place to get started. Once we've got that figured out, and say you're looking at a 200-pound individual, that's going to be 800 calories coming from just protein intake. We can subtract those calories out from the total that we're looking to hit from what we calculated earlier, and then we've got fats and carbs left over. So how do we determine where to place the rest of these calories? Well, first, we need to know what's the difference between the energy sources coming from fats versus from carbs. With fat energy, this is going to be utilized for activity that is very low intensity. So walking around, just sitting down, sleeping at night. This is when your body is not very active. It doesn't need a lot of energy very quickly. And so this is where fats are perfect. Fat is very energy dense. It's 9 calories per gram. And so your body can pull vast amounts of energy from it while it doesn't need it rapidly. Whereas if we're performing really intense activity, such as weightlifting, sprinting, any sort of vigorous cardio, or just more than your average type of movement, that's where your body is going to preferentially start utilizing carbohydrates. Those activities require energy very rapidly and in large quantities, and the body can get energy out of carbohydrates much more quickly than it can out of fats. So if you're somebody that's performing a lot of really intense activity, this is where carbs are incredibly important. Whereas if you're somebody that performs no intense physical activity, you essentially don't need carbohydrates. There are essential fatty acids and essential amino acids, meaning that you need to consume X amount of fats and proteins to deliver your body's basic nutrient needs, but there is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. So other than the fuel that your brain is going to be using, which is about 120 grams of carbs per day, if you're not doing any other intense activity beyond that, then you don't really need too many more carbs. And obviously, there's the ketogenic diet and all of that stuff, and we're not going to branch into that in this video. Just suffice it to say that the amount of activity that you're performing and the type of activity that you're performing is what will dictate how you divvy up your remaining calories from fats and from carbs. So once we've got the basics down and we understand how calories work relative to different goals and how many calories are in each of the macronutrients, we can go about crafting a diet suited to the individual and their goal. Now, there's another layer to this that gets a little bit more complex in that the amount of calories that are coming from different macronutrients are not all created equally. And so beyond the amount of calories per gram that each of the macronutrients contains, there's also an energy element to the digestion process. And what I mean by that is just because you're getting 40 calories from protein and 40 calories from carbs and 40 calories from fats doesn't mean that those are all going to be the exact same amount of energy to the body. So each of the three macronutrients requires a different amount of energy to digest the food that's coming into it. So your fats and your carbs, your body's primary energy sources, are very easily digestible. I might be a little bit off with the percentages here, but it's around maybe 2 to 5% of the calories that you consume from fats and carbs are burned off in the digestion process. 5% might be a little bit high there. Whereas with protein, there's so much more energy required to digest protein that upwards of 27 to 30% of the calories that you consume from protein are just burned off in the digestion process. So looking across different diets that have the same amount of calories but different macronutrient profiles can tell a very different story. So even if we've got 2,000 calories in one group and 2,000 calories in another diet, if those two have very different levels of protein intake, the higher protein intake diet with the same amount of calories is actually going to be burning off more calories than their lower protein counterpart. And this is where high protein diets become really effective when it comes to weight loss and fat loss goals, because you're doing less work and you're consuming the same amount of energy up front, but your body is working so much harder to actually process those calories and turn them into usable energy and help rebuild the cells that have been broken down, that you're actually going to be netting more fat loss and a greater caloric deficit than somebody that's eating a very low protein diet but has the same amount of overall calories coming in. So I hope that was helpful. If you guys have any questions or concerns, feel free to sound off in the comments, and I will talk with you guys again soon.